Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and thank you for listening.
You've kind of gone into your pitch.
It's allergies. It is.
I could hear the pitch talk there.
Yeah, well, let's just say if you'd like
the show,
if you'd like to support the show, please go to jeffersonhour.com. We're really proud of the website and the gentleman who does all the work on it. There's a ton of information there. It's the gateway to write to President Jefferson and ask him a question, send us a comment about the show, or whatever, and we appreciate that as much as anything. And, of course, if you want to support the show, you can go to the page, click on Donate. A lot of people choose to become 1776 Club members, and that gives them the opportunity to get any extra content that we do come up with, but we pretty much give all our good stuff away on the show, right?
Well, but there is a trip coming to Cuba, and 1776 Club
Cuba?
members. I'm leading a cultural journey to Cuba.
When did this come up?
Oh, it's going to be next year.
Have you let my business partner Mike know?
No.
Oh, he loves Cuba. He wants to go again.
Well, there you go. So you can pay for you and your spouse and Graham.
I'm not going there. I'm scared.
Yeah, me too. But if we're going to Cuba, and first dibs go to 1776 Club members.
Nice.
But you were making the pitch. If you like this program, give us your ranch, your farm, your home in Hawaii.
Well, I didn't say any of that.
But I'll tell you this. People send gifts, and let me just thank people. So sitting in front of me is a shirt from Bo.
Yeah, because when Bo was on the show, you whined so hard. And then like 2 days later, the shirt showed up. He sent a package. I thought it was for me.
You took both of the shirts.
Well, I took him to dinner. No, there was only one shirt and a cookbook, and I'm going to give you the cookbook.
Okay, but anyway, thank you, Bo. And then I remember I was talking about Virginia hams.
Oh, my.
And Virginians sent me a beautiful ham. Thank you, thank you.
Are you kidding?
I ate it over Easter. It was outstanding. And I just got a book in the mail today of Thomas Jefferson, Humanist, by Layman, one of the best books ever written about Thomas Jefferson.
What is it?
Keep them gifts coming.
Some kind of insecurity you're feeding with free gifts, or what is it?
No, I love the idea that, first of all, gifts are the greatest thing you can do. And gifts are not about cost. They're about thoughtfulness.
That's true.
And the gifts that I get, a ukulele.
Yeah, which you still have to bring in.
That ukulele is a work of art.
I want to see it.
And a ham from
that's pretty
Virginia.
Fun. Yeah.
Honey comes. Pat Brodowski sends seeds and dibbles and other agricultural instruments.
Yeah.
Keep them coming, folks. Whatever you got. Animal, mineral, vegetable.
I think he has a condition.
Yeah. So it's begging.
Uh-huh.
And it works. Keep it coming. Wine.
Fun show this week. Notes on the state of Virginia. It's always a little touchy because it is really the source of so much criticism of Jefferson, and understandably so.
Well, he wrote these two passages on race in Notes on Virginia. And the amazing thing is, as Fawn Brodie points out in her biography, is that they're quoted by people who love him as an emancipationist, and they're quoted by people who loathe him as a racist. So it's like yin and yang. Which Jefferson do you quote here?
I get a little tough on the president over that.
Well, I think it's important. I refuse to ever read or quote those passages again, because when I first started out doing Jefferson, I was shocked by them. But today, the whole mood of the country has changed. And those statements are just trash, just unbearable trash. You can contextualize them all you want, but it's a blot, and a very serious blot, on Jefferson that he put such thoughts to paper. People can find them for themselves if they go to the Jefferson Hour
But
site.
Along with that, there's so much fun and worthwhile on there. Now, I know you can download this book for free.
Yes.
So we should probably
Stick it up.
Put some links up on the link. And before we go to the show, one last thing, if I might.
I got a couple things.
Oh, well, go ahead then.
No, you.
No, you.
Okay, well, first of all, cultural tour is coming. Still 3 places left on the big Monticello-sponsored
3?
Lewis and Clark
I thought
trip.
that was sold out.
No,
I keep asking you that.
3 things for this summer, July 20th through 29th. So if you want to join the high patron culture of Monticello on the wild and scenic Missouri River in Montana and on the Lolo Trail, go to the website. Jefferson in France, I think there are 6 places left for the October Jefferson in France trip. I just told you about Cuba. Go look for that. And there are the winter encampments on The Space Race, and Charles Dickens.
He says, we got an email from somebody who did you read that one? It was about Don't Forget This Guy.
Yeah.
Did you read that one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
And then finally, I just yesterday put together the itinerary for a trip in England next year.
Wow.
Of Shakespeare, John Donne, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Bath, Stratford-on-Avon, London, the Globe
I
Theatre.
just got a copy of the audiobook, The Year of Lear. Have you read that?
Yeah, that's a great book.
Okay,
My
good.
daughter took a class from Shapiro at Columbia.
I thought it would be good listening as I garden.
It is good because it's about 1605, the year that King Lear was written, but it's really about the conditions of London and Great Britain at that time. So all these cultural tours, now's the time to sign up for them. I'm so excited about them, and I'm particularly excited about Jefferson in France at the moment, the Canal de Midi, Bordeaux, wineries that date back to Jefferson's time and have a cultural memory of Jefferson, et cetera, et cetera.
Next week, listener questions, and we have one about Jefferson's suggestions for traveling in Europe. That's really good.
Oh, they're great.
But before we say goodbye, we started this by you thanking Bo for the T-shirt, right?
And the hams and everything else.
Yes. Well, I sent Bo, texted him a photo of you holding the T-shirt, and he just responded, "That's terrific. Love it."
Yeah. So, now I would like the key to the city.
And time to go to this show.
Of Jefferson's Poplar Forest.
Thanks very much for
listening. We love you all. Keep listening and read Notes on Virginia.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swensen, and seated across from me is President Thomas Jefferson. Good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, I'd like to get right to it this week. It's said that every day, or nearly every day, you devoted hours to writing, and this included notes and memoranda and, of course, thousands and thousands of pieces of correspondence, letters which numbered literally in the tens of thousands. For more than 60 years, you maintained record books at Monticello, financial dealings and the weather, but you only wrote and published one book, Notes on the State of Virginia. And sir, it is said that this was a book you weren't sure you would publish and weren't sure you should write, and if you did, you probably would not do it under your own name. I believe, sir, you referred to it as a, quote, cultural accident. Could you talk about that?
Well, it is true that the only book that I overtly published in a significant way as an author was Notes on the State of Virginia. The first publication actually came in France. I had it privately printed in 1785, about 200 copies. Then a piratical edition appeared in French. It was badly garbled, badly translated. And at that point, James Madison, my closest friend back in Virginia, urged me to publish the book seriously, not as a private printing, but as a book. And the reason for that is that he was certain that now that there was a garbled French edition, there would be a retranslation into English, and that English retranslation would bear little or no resemblance to the actual text that I had written. And so at that point, very reluctantly, knowing that a pirate edition would soon appear in the English language, I oversaw a publishing house in London owned by a man named John Stockdale, and they came out in 1787 with the first English language edition of Notes on the State of Virginia. I had not intended this. When I wrote the manuscript, I did not intend it to be a published book. If I had known that it were going to be a published book, I would have written quite a different one.
It was based on a series of 20-some questions that you called queries. Who sent these questions to you, sir?
Well, the French were our allies, of course, during the war. Thank you to Dr. Franklin. And the French were therefore interested in their investment. They invested millions, in fact, to the point of bankrupting the French treasury for the American cause, not because they believed in liberty or a republican form of government, but because Britain was their inveterate enemy, and the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. So the French gave us loans and outright gifts in the millions of francs, millions of dollars, from 1778 onward. And they wanted to know a little bit more about the world that they were helping to break free from British tyranny. And they sent around a questionnaire of 21 questions to every one of the colonies.
So it wasn't just Virginia then?
No, every governor or every legislature in the country got a set of these questions.
Do you know, sir, if any of the other states responded?
Yes, almost all of them responded in some sense. Most of them responded in a very basic and cursory fashion, just answering in a few sentences the queries that had been put to them by the French. A couple of the states took it a little farther. I did the most of anyone. First of all, I wanted to answer the questions.
Well, you took this very seriously then, sir.
Well, I saw it as opportunity. So I saw it as opportunity not only to show gratitude towards the French for what they were doing for us, but it gave me a chance to step back and to bring together information, data, from a wide range of sources, a kind of, in a sense, an encyclopedia of Greater Virginia, or an almanac of the known facts of Virginia writ large. Virginia at that time included your West Virginia and most of the Ohio Valley, and in fact had claims all the way to the Rocky Mountains. So this was an opportunity for me to bring together information that I had been collecting for many years, but otherwise probably would never have published.
I don't want to say that you were boasting, but it's clear from reading the book that you were a proud Virginian, sir.
Oh, more than that. I always called myself a Virginian first and an American second. When I speak of my country, I don't mean the United States. I mean Virginia. Virginia was the largest state. Virginia was the most populous state. Virginia was the nurse, or certainly the second nursery of the Revolution after Massachusetts. Virginia produced Patrick Henry, of extraordinary importance. Virginia produced George Washington, our commander-in-chief. Virginia produced George Mason, whose Virginia Declaration of Rights was in some regards a warm-up act for my Declaration of Independence. Virginia produced James Madison, the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights, and Virginia produced the fifth president of the United States, James Monroe, among many others. So Virginia was, in my time, was much more central to the way the United States understood itself than it has become in your time. In your time, you would have to look at states like Texas or California or possibly New York or Florida to give you a sense of the centrality of Virginia in my era. And so I was a very proud American. Of course, we were trying something new under the sun. We were creating the first People's Republic in the history of the world. But I was also exceedingly proud as a Virginian, and I wanted to make the case for Virginia, not only in the rest of the United States, but to the world. And as you perhaps know, there were detractors in Europe who felt that the New World was degenerate in some important ways, and they didn't believe that much good would come out of it, and they had a deep skepticism about our Republican experiment.
I'd like to discuss that further. Before we do, though, sir, for people who are unfamiliar with this work, as I said earlier, it was based on a series of queries. Now, I'm not certain if there were 21 or 22.
21 was the number.
But you ended up with 23, and it said that you sorted through all these questions and categorized them and made better sense of them.
Well, I have a great love of order, as you know, and I love taxonomy, the taxonomy of the clouds, taxonomy of the periodic table, taxonomy of books and library classification. This was the era of that. The Enlightenment was creating these classification systems. Linnaeus had famously told us that every known plant could be given a Latin binomial name, and that this would contradistinguish it from every other plant, and so on. And so this was the era of classification and order and grids and questionnaires. And so the one that was produced by the French was right in the tradition of that, and something that I took great joy in. And so I wanted to, when I got it, I thought, well, this is going to take some time. I don't want to just do a cursory response as most governors did. I also saw it, as I say, as opportunity. But I wanted to step back and say, well, what really does one need to know about the Commonwealth of Virginia? What are its borders? What was the history of its chartering? What sort of people founded it and when? What does it have to do with Sir Walter Raleigh's explorations of the Outer Banks and the New World? What sort of aborigines lived here? What kind of a climate does it have? Does it have salt mines or gold mines or silver mines or lead mines? What sort of crops can be grown here, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to provide a kind of encyclopedic almanac of the Commonwealth of Virginia, a compendium not of everything known about Virginia, of course, but at least the foundation facts that would be useful to anyone who was looking into that subject.
You had categorizations of the rivers, the waterways, agricultural land, crops that were grown.
Laws, constitutions, religion, manners, manufacturing.
But you get into that a little bit later in the book. In the beginning, it seems that it's mostly statistics, and you had some help in acquiring all of these numbers.
Of course. So I had a habit of taking down notes on a little ivory tablet that I carried around with me, and I would use a pencil and write out information. If somebody said to me that the Ohio River had its source at Pittsburgh, I would write that down. And then when I had leisure, I would transcribe those penciled notes from the ivory tablet into permanent files and keep them on rivers and on mountains and on the coastline and our manufacturing, such as it was, and education and so on and so forth. And so these files grew larger over time, and I had friends scattered around not only Virginia but around the country, and I would frequently ask them to contribute what data they had that might be useful to me, and they often did that in letters. And then I would transcribe those pieces into my permanent files so that when I finally came to write rivers, for example, one of the first chapters in Notes on Virginia,
which goes into great detail, sir.
I had a large database to work from, and I could write about the Ohio. I even wrote about the Missouri. Now, the Missouri might not seem to you to be a Virginia river, but remember, Virginia was making claims all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And while we're on it, let me just say this of the Missouri River, which, of course, later became important in the Lewis and Clark expedition. I regard the Missouri, the one that heads up at Three Forks in your Montana, I regard that as the main branch of what we call the Mississippi. And I regard the upper Mississippi, the one that heads up in your Minnesota, as a tributary of the main trunk, the main branch, which starts in the Rock Mountains and goes all the way through St. Louis and down to New Orleans. And so I make the claim in Notes on Virginia that there's some misnomer in calling the Minnesota branch the main one, when in fact it's the Montana branch that is supreme.
You do write about the natural resources, the mapping of Virginia, but then you also get into some things that got you in trouble. We're going to take a short break in a moment, Mr. President, but when we come back, I'd like to talk about that part of the book in detail.
Of course, I would not have written some of the things that I put to paper had I known that this book would be published. And even the private edition that I created in 1785, I was quite concerned about the reaction of my fellow Virginians to several of the key subjects.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to The Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we're speaking with President Jefferson about his one and only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia. And when we took our break, sir, I had said that I wanted to talk about, well, some of the views you had written in Notes on the State of Virginia caused political trouble for you when they were published. And you must have been aware that some of your ideas would disturb certain citizens. In fact, you wrote of your worries, wondering if, quote, the publication would do most harm or good. And it would seem a major concern were your views on slavery and the Virginia State Constitution.
Right. I had three concerns, particularly in issuing this book. One was my criticisms of the Virginia Constitution, and I'm happy to go into greater detail on that. The second was my strictures about slavery. I essentially argued that God is just, and his justice cannot sleep forever, that Virginia plantation owners like myself who owned and bought and sold slaves were so greatly in violation of natural right that it wasn't clear to me that God's just wrath would not at some point punish us for this abominable crime, and that it was in our interest to emancipate our Negro brethren sooner rather than later. And I knew that that would get me in trouble with a great number of Virginians, and of course it did. And then the third thing that I feared was that there is a veiled attack on Patrick Henry in the book, because after I left the governorship in some disarray in June of 1781, Henry made it clear that he would not mind being named dictator. He thought that the crisis was so great that we needed a dictator, at least temporarily, and he put himself forward. And I felt that that was a profound violation of the very thing we had fought the revolution to avoid, and that this was a dangerous offer that he made, and if it had been accepted, it would have spelled the death of the American Republic, of American liberty, right at the beginning. And so I wrote a pretty strong critique of that, not naming him, but it was clear to everyone whom I had in mind.
Well, back to the book, sir. In June of 1785, you wrote, quote, "It is possible that in my own country these strictures might produce an irritation which would indispose the people towards the two great objects I have in view, that is, the emancipation of their slaves and the settlement of their constitution on a firmer and more permanent basis."
Yes, so let me go to the Constitution first. My larger argument here is that if you irritate people you're trying to get to make reforms, either on the question of the Constitution of Virginia or on the question of slavery, if you only upset them, annoy them, frustrate them, and anger them, then that often hardens their view without reforming it in any way. In other words, you have to be really suave and strategic when you try to move a people towards necessary reforms. And if you push too hard, too fast, or if there's any righteousness in you, or if you criticize them in some sort of ad hominem way, or make them feel that they are illiberal or bigoted or backward, then they often get their back up and their positions harden. And so I feared that in publishing, in printing even, notes on Virginia, it might have exactly the opposite effect of what I had intended. And so that really, really concerned me, and I felt that we should be very cautious about into whose hands we placed copies of this book. So as to the constitutional question, it's really this. The Constitution of Virginia was created by the House of Delegates of Virginia. In other words, there was not a constitutional convention separate from routine legislation.
Yes, and in your book you write how most of that came from English law.
Right, so we not only were shoveling into our Constitution a whole set of things that had been around in Great Britain for a very long time, not all of which were bad, by the way, but we also were doing it in a way that did not give it constitutional legitimacy. When the National Founding Fathers built the Constitution of the United States in 1787, this was after the publication of this book, they had a special convention in Philadelphia. It wasn't the Continental Congress. It wasn't routine legislation. There was a special self-conscious moment in which a group of people outside of routine constitutional legislative practice met together and fashioned a new constitution for the United States. That's what should have been done in Virginia. You can't expect people in power to craft a new constitution because they are so self-interested in its results. They can't do the right thing necessarily because they are interested in maintaining their own authority, their own tenure in office, their own emoluments, and so on. And so it seemed to me that Virginia had made a terrible mistake by generating its new constitution from within its legislature and not calling a special body and then having special ratification that went directly to the people. And I was hoping that in 1783 there was talk of another constitution. I was hoping they would do it in the correct way this time, and I actually drafted a new constitution for Virginia, which I eventually published as an appendix to Notes on the State of Virginia. It turns out that new constitutional convention did not happen, and so I felt that this would make me seem like some sort of a righteous outsider or a know-it-all or somebody who was trying to delegitimize the existing constitution of my Commonwealth.
You mean through the publication of this?
Right. Probably I should have not even printed it, because once it was printed, it was inevitably pirated, and it eventually came into true publication, and then anyone who wanted to could get a copy of it.
Well, sure, it's a great gain for those of us who lived during my time, because you state so many of your views clearly.
But you didn't live in my time, and you didn't have to bear the burden of the criticism and the abuse that came from having called into question the legitimacy of the existing Constitution of Virginia.
As I said, sir, there are so much in this book that people from my time can go back and look at. I wonder if we might talk a bit about, I believe it was Query 27, religion?
Now there, I did not expect as much abuse as I took. I had said three things: the attack on Patrick Henry, although not by name, my strictures on the Virginia Constitution, and my call for some sort of plan of emancipation for our slaves.
Well, you did argue, though. You defended this separation of church and state, arguing that it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. A famous statement in my time, sir.
Right, and that sentence of every sentence written in Notes on Virginia was the one that was thrown into my face immediately and for the rest of my life by Puritans, by evangelicals, by people that are prudish, by people that resented what they took to be sarcasm, by people that felt that I must be an atheist.
Yes, you have my sympathy, sir. Let me give you an instance, and for our listeners, that statement came up in a presidential campaign in 1800. A gentleman, William Wynn, who I'm sure that you recall, sir. He was a well-known Federalist clergyman, and he published a campaign pamphlet that accused you of atheism, and he warned voters that, quote, "Let my neighbors once persuade himself that there is no God, and he will soon pick my pocket and break not only my leg, but my neck."
Well, let me read the sentence again, and I ask all of those who are listening to listen in a rational way. It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. If you pick my pocket or break my leg or steal my hog or burn down my barn, now that's injury. But if you believe in the Trinity and I don't, if you believe in the Immaculate Conception and I don't, if you believe in the inspired Word of God in the Old Testament and I don't, if you believe that Jesus was the Christ and I don't, if you believe in a Hindu God or a Jewish God or a Zoroastrian God or a Manichaean God or a Muslim God, that does me no injury. That's what you think. Those are private, sacred, sovereign thoughts. If you attack me on the basis of some verse in your religion, now I have to oppose you. It's only when doctrine or belief breaks out into hostile action that there is an injury. It seems to me that that is not only natural law and good sense, but I don't think that any reasonable person can really object to that principle. And let me, sir, read one other quick passage from that query, that chapter in Notes on Virginia, which is much more powerful. Millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, imprisoned. Yet we have not advanced 1 inch towards uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion? To make one half the world fools and the other half hypocrites.
I'd like to move on to query number 18, the particular customs and manners that may happen to be received in that state. You wrote about the liberties of a nation. Did you recall, sir?
Yes, there are two dissertations in Notes on Virginia on slavery and race. One of them under the query laws and another under the query manners. And one of them is a passionate call for emancipation and either gradual or immediate. And the other one is a kind of a sociological examination of the nature and capacity of what you call African Americans. But the one that is quoted more positively argues that God is interested. He believes in the welfare of slaves and black people, that he will not rest forever, that it's not impossible that we could see a slave insurrection. In fact, I think we have to assume that that will come. And if there is a slave insurrection, there's no attribute of God that would side with white property owners or plantation owners, that if there is a God, that God is going to side with the oppressed slaves. And so all of the justice of the thing is on the side of the blacks. All of the corruption and failure of commitment to natural law is with the whites. That it's clear to anyone who thinks about this that the justice cannot be with the white oppressors, that the justice has to be with the black oppressed. And as I say, his justice cannot sleep forever. But if there is a slave insurrection, if we don't find a better path to free our Negro brethren, if we don't find an enlightened path to do the right thing, that insurrection is going to be a bloodbath. And it might, I know this sounds apocalyptic, but if there were a national slave insurrection in America, extending perhaps all the way to the Caribbean, it could end in the extermination of one or the other race.
Forgive me, Mr. President, but in the book, you make some fairly severe judgments about the differences between the races. And I mean no disrespect, but sir, who are you to judge?
There's no answer to your question. All I can say is that these questions were being examined in Enlightenment circles in France, in Edinburgh, in the Low Countries, in Great Britain, in London, the Royal Society, that the intellectual community, the Republic of Letters, such as it was, worldwide, was looking at questions of race. American Indians, Asiatics, Africans, slaves, freed blacks, you name it, that the Enlightenment, in its attempt to make sense of the world and to classify everything, was looking at races and trying to decide whether the book of Genesis really encapsulated the origins of humankind, whether there was a single pair, Adam and Eve, or whether there were multiple Genesis moments around the planet, and so on. So these were questions that were in the minds of every thoughtful and learned person in the world, and I had one advantage over most of them. I was the only person looking at these questions who actually lived with black people.
I do apologize for the severity of my question, but it needed to be asked, and I would like to go from there to some of the other things that you talked about, that you wrote in your book.
Yes, but let me say this much more about that before we go on. In that famous passage, which has done so much damage to my reputation.
Yes, you gave fodder to modern-day critics that you can't imagine, sir.
I have no doubt of that. There are things probably that I should not have put to paper in Notes on Virginia. But let me say this much. When in that famous, maybe notorious or infamous passage in the query about manners, I do say I advance these thoughts as a suspicion only, and I hope that whatever judgments or conclusions I have drawn will be disproved by time and better observation.
Yes, sir. If you lived in my time, I'm certain you would reconsider all of that. But to your credit, you also wrote, "Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end." Very prophetic, sir.
Well, I'm so sorry if that's true. That if the founding relationship between African Americans and their white owners was slavery, it seems to me that the legacy of that is going to be, if not perpetual, nearly so. That the legacy of the gross injustice with which the relations between the two races were created in North America, beginning in 1619, that legacy is going to have a very long shelf life. And it's not altogether clear to me that it will ever be completely resolved. And I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic, but I cannot look upon the resentment that former slaves will feel and the anxiety, or perhaps guilt, that former slaveholders will feel without seeing what looks to me like perpetual social tension.
When one looks at America, its history, founded somewhat in white supremacy, I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that, it is our original sin, perhaps, and something that we will continue to pay for. So your fears and suspicions are correct.
If we could have snapped our fingers and turned that slave ship brought by the Dutch in 1619 around and never introduced a single slave to North America or the Americas in general, our chance of succeeding in our experiment in pursuit of human happiness would have been dramatically and maybe infinitely more possible.
Well, ending on a happier note, Mr. Jefferson, I do want to thank you very much for this conversation this week in all its aspects. And you should know, sir, that your Notes on the State of Virginia has been preserved. Your original copy has been preserved. And it is considered one of the most important books written during your time, sir.
I would just ask that the people who are listening would take their copy of this book and rip out the passages that they find offensive, and then read the rest of it, because so much of it is cheerful, a celebration of this country, a belief in the fertility and fecundity and majesty and the sublimity of North America. It's a vindication of America in the eyes of the world, and only a tiny percentage of it is controversial in the ways that we have examined.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson.
You are most welcome.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, now safely out of costume, and sitting across from me is my friend, Mr. David Swensen, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome, sir.
Yes, and Jefferson and his book, Notes on the State of Virginia.
This is the Jefferson Hour Book Club. We've been advertising this for some time. Finally, we have gotten to Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which, by the way, in spite of its controversial aspects, is a magnificent book. It's it's regarded as one of the classics of early American literature. It's way bigger than Virginia, and it turns out it's kind of a compendium. You said this in the interview. It's kind of a compendium of Jefferson's way of seeing America. When I reread it for this program, I was surprised at how much of what we love about Jefferson actually comes out of this book.
Does. Yeah, it does. While reading the book again and doing some research, I came across something. I don't know if you know about this or not. If you don't, I am certain that you will want to check it out, and I will see to it that there's a link put up on jeffersonhour.com, the website. It's Conserving Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. It's a YouTube video.
Wow.
Ann Bentley, who is the curator of art, Massachusetts Historical Society. The Massachusetts Historical Society owns a remarkable document in Thomas Jefferson's own handwriting, the text of his only full-length book. Did you know this? I'm assuming you know.
They have a copy.
The copy.
His
Jefferson's
first copy.
own hand. And it's the one where he made corrections and wrote new pages and then pasted
I've
it.
seen this. And it's so amazing because he's so fastidious, David. He takes these other, like he'll write out in his exquisite penmanship.
Tiny
It's like origami. He folds then the insertion, and it folds, and then it's glued into the margin of that page.
These are complete overlays.
Wow.
And it's there's actually a little interactive thing at the site, so
I want to
it's
go
really
see
fun.
that.
Yeah, it's at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and we will put a link.
I need to go there and see this copy.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. How did it end up in Massachusetts, though?
Well, because his daughter.
Oh, right.
His granddaughter married a Coolidge from Massachusetts, and then Martha wound up moving to Massachusetts, to Boston for a time. So Massachusetts has a significant number of great Jefferson manuscripts and documents because of the patterns of marriage amongst his grandchildren.
We did get a number of inquiries mail about the show, and we don't really have time to get all of them in depth, but there was one that came in from Dale Summers. I know this will resonate with you, sir. He writes, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address is the best prose in American literature.
I agree with that.
When he wrote it, Lincoln may have remembered Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. And then he's got some comparative passages. It's quite good. Yes.
Well, Lincoln knew his Jefferson. I can tell you that. It's a great letter. Thank you for sending it to us. Lincoln knew his Jefferson well, and part of Lincoln's achievement was to try to square the fact that Jefferson was a Southern racist and slaveholder with the incredibly optimistic and hopeful nature of the Declaration of Independence. In some respects, Lincoln helped to save Jefferson from himself by saying we've got to read the work, the vision, the magnificent optimism of the Declaration of Independence, and not get stuck on the circumstances of Jefferson's life alone. I think that's right.
Again, this came from Dale Summers. I'll give you this email.
Yes, I like it.
And he's from Fargo.
Really? Fargo, North Dakota?
And listens on KDSU in Fargo.
KDSU.
Yeah, there was another letter here that came in from Matthew Deutsch. And this was actually to Mr. Jefferson, and he talks about reading his book. And something that we've talked about before on this program that's great fun has to do with the moose.
Bringing the moose over to France for Buffon.
Yeah, and that's such a good story. It's a long one. Can you give us
Give you the short version.
Yeah.
So a lot of Notes on Virginia is this comparison between European fauna and American fauna, because Buffon and other European savants had said that America was degenerate, that its climate was cooler and moister, and therefore its animals were not up to the same standards as their European cousins and so on. And Jefferson knew this was horrible and a lie and not true scientifically. So he spends a lot of time in Notes on Virginia trying to show that animals common to both continents are, actually, if anything, more fertile, more fecund, larger in America, and that there's no degeneracy. And so, but Buffon was not convinced when he read a copy of Notes on Virginia, so Jefferson wrote back to Madison and said, I need a moose. And eventually, after a long and tedious and really kind of almost epic
He shot like 20 guys out, right?
attempt, he gets the moose.
Yeah.
And the moose comes over in a box. It's dead, of course. Comes over in a box, in a crate, and Jefferson's kind of forgotten about it. He has it put back together, and he actually has it sent to the jardin, to the salon of the Comte de Buffon, and with the compliments of the American ministers. And Jefferson spent a fortune, private money, as secretary to, as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI. He spent his own money to import a moose carcass and have it reconstructed so he could show Europe may be many things. It does not have a moose.
And he wondered where this might have been found. It's in Bill Bryson's book, A Short History of Everything.
Well, it's written about in many different places, but it's all true. And think of what kind of a man this is, Jefferson, who, to prove a point, spends thousands of dollars in our currency to have a moose shot, stuffed, presented to this European. Today we have, of course, video and measuring devices and still cameras, and we have lots of ways to prove a point. But for Jefferson, the moose had to be physical.
An interesting story, a good place to end. If you'd like to find out more about Notes on the State of Virginia, go to our website, jeffersonhour.com. You can support the show there and find some of these links. But now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Jefferson was a private man, at times a secretive man. For reasons that are not clear, at an early point in his 83 years, he walled off his inner life and fashioned a stoic persona that he presented to the world. He presented that persona not just to the big world, but to his own immediate world too. He wanted us to see him as a mild-mannered gardener and man of learning who was reluctantly called from the plow at a revolutionary time, but who would rather be calculating an eclipse or grafting peach trees. And indeed, he was all of those things, but those are not the only things that he was either. Jefferson was, for example, the most masterful politician of his era, though he would deny any political ambition or will to power, and he was constantly pining for what he called our own dear Monticello, where he could pretend to live above the sordid world of politics. Jefferson's propensity to pose as a modest agrarian with exquisite manners and civility is one reason why some people regard him as inauthentic, one reason why many prefer John Adams, who wore his soul on his sleeve, or Alexander Hamilton, who was perfectly willing to say that it was all about power, money, ambition, glory, war, primacy, and sexual conquest. Adams and Hamilton seem like versions of our own disillusioned selves, while Jefferson often seems like a character from an 18th century novel of manners. Like characters in Jane Austen, Jefferson seldom actually tells us what he feels or even what he's really thinking. What he offers us instead is what a highly evolved and exquisitely civilized small r Republican would be expected to say or write on every occasion. Meanwhile, John Adams just sputters and mutters and gets it all off of his chest every time. Why was Jefferson so secretive? Why did he construct that Enlightenment persona, and to what extent was some other Jefferson hiding behind it? Was he hiding from us? Or was he hiding from himself? Over the years, I have attempted several times to make a list of the 10 most revealing things that Jefferson ever wrote. It reveals a great deal about Jefferson to conclude that you have to look hard and with a great sense of nuance to excavate any very revealing sentence from his 80 volumes of writings. It is easy to distill Jefferson's vision of America from his works, for he is the most articulate of visionaries, but very difficult to know much about the actual human being who sat down at his exquisite writing desk. Naturally, I have theories about all of this, but for the moment I want to address the question of his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia. Jefferson wrote Notes on Virginia mostly in 1781, at one of the darkest moments of his life. He had fled away from Monticello just ahead of a British arrest party led by Bannister Tarleton. He had abandoned his governorship at a time when the people of Virginia were desperately in need of a strong and persevering executive. Then he fell from a horse and broke his wrist. His 32-year-old wife Martha was ill and clearly moving towards an early death. Meanwhile, the people of Virginia, or at least their representatives in the House of Delegates, believed that his behavior as governor had been so inadequate that he must be formally investigated for malfeasance and, in the minds of some, cowardice. Jefferson spent the summer of 1781 brooding and nursing his wrist. He managed at the next legislative session to clear his name. It didn't hurt that the war was now over and we won. But he told his protege James Monroe that the distrust of his fellow Virginians, quote, had inflicted a wound on my spirit, which will only be cured by the all-healing grave. He was holed up through the summer and fall of 1781 at his second plantation, Poplar Forest. His most sensitive biographer, Fawn Brodie, believes that at this nadir of his political career, Jefferson was so full of rage, bitterness, self-pity, and self-doubt that he wrote a much more candid treatise than he would have written at a more serene and confident period of his life. In his own mind, he was not writing a book at all, but merely answering queries sent to him by a French diplomat, filling out a questionnaire, as it were. He did not expect the manuscript to be published. He was writing unguardedly because his carefully constructed public persona had been shattered by revolutionary events, because he reckoned his political career was over, because he felt misunderstood and wanted to explain himself, because he needed the catharsis, and because he had passionate ideas about the future of Virginia and the American experiment. Jefferson's unguardedness in 1781 is most fortunate for us, for in Notes on the State of Virginia we have the most revealing document he ever wrote. It is amazing how many of the most important pronouncements of his life were made in this seemingly dry-as-dust almanac, 21 Answers to 21 Queries about climate, manufacturing, rivers, animals, plants, minerals, population, and the Virginia legal system. No wonder Jefferson had the book privately printed in a limited number of copies in Paris, and then fretted and agonized when it finally got published into the world in 1787. He had, for a few months in the wake of his ignominious departure from the governorship, in the presence of a frail wife he must have known he was going to lose, let down his guard and written what he actually felt and thought about a wide range of subjects, and he knew that what he felt and thought was going to upset people around him. He paid a significant price for his rare interlude of real candor. His critics quibbled with all sorts of passages in Notes on Virginia, and 2 of them have haunted him ever since. The first one comes in Query 17, Religion, one of the greatest pronouncements ever made about freedom of conscience. In a very unguarded moment, Jefferson wrote, "The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." Righteous evangelicals pounced on this statement immediately, and their tribe, as Jefferson might put it, has been pouncing on it righteously ever since. It is, in fact, one of the most quoted passages in Notes on Virginia. You can even imagine opposition research today constructing attack ads on Jefferson in a presidential race. An atheist, an infidel for president. Think about it. Is this what God wants for America? The other haunting passage is Jefferson's pseudo-scientific dissertation about black people in Query 14, Laws. It's too horrible to quote. You can, if you wish, read it for yourself. We know that Jefferson was conflicted about race and slavery. I always wonder, where was the psychological fallout from this most profound contradiction of his life, the slaveholder who can write, "All men are created equal"? Most of the time, Jefferson seems not to have experienced any psychic fallout over the hypocrisy that the greatest American champion of liberty bought and sold other human beings, had them whipped, at times bred them for market, sold them to pay his wine bills, and took one sexually. His equanimity and cheerfulness in the face of the appalling issue of race in Jefferson is almost impossible for us to understand. Frankly, I think the psychological fallout came screaming out in Query 14, a kind of dark, racist diatribe against African Americans, a subterranean fantasy projection of Jefferson's guilt, anger, eroticism, self-protection, and what is known as casuistry. In this unguarded moment when he was at the lowest ebb of his self-confidence, Jefferson opened the iron gates of his id and let his most reptilian energies pour out onto the page. Apparently, he can only live with slavery if he can convince himself that black people are inferior and are therefore beneficiaries of white supervision. He pretends he is making a sober, even cautious scientific analysis of the distinctions between black and white people, but in some sense he is projecting his massive self-disappointment, for being a slaveholder of all things, onto the very people he has enslaved. It's hard reading, and nothing Jefferson ever wrote in his long and exceedingly verbal life has damaged his reputation as much as this spasm of naked race aggression. And if it is possible to make things worse, Query 14's dissertation on race ends in a fantasy of monstrous hostility dressed up as a routine laboratory procedure. I'm quoting, "The opinion that they are inferior in the faculties of reason and imagination," Jefferson wrote, "must be hazarded with great diffidence. To justify a general conclusion requires many observations, even where the subject may be submitted to the anatomical knife, to optical glasses, to analysis by fire, or by solvents. How much more, then, where it is a faculty, not a substance we are examining?" Think about this. Solvents, by which he means acid, the laboratory oven, and the anatomical knife. How, asks Jefferson, can we understand black people without these scientific tools? All you can say of this is, where did this Freudian moment come from? Fortunately, Notes on the State of Virginia has scores of great passages, poetic invocations of America, idealistic essays about Republican forms of government, paeans to the agrarian way of life, spirited, often humorous defenses of American greatness against its European critics, and dozens of paragraphs that represent the best of Thomas Jefferson, the best of America, and the best of the Enlightenment. Still, Vaughan Brody was right. If you want to understand the man behind the serene and neoclassical mask, you have to read Thomas Jefferson's only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, with great care. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.